There are 4 real mysteries hiding inside the Last Supper. One of them is a melody nobody noticed for 400 years. One is a myth that fooled millions of readers. And the last one, even skeptics can't fully explain away. Let's go through all 4. And if you love unsolved mysteries hiding in plain sight, hit subscribe, because this channel exists to find them. It's 1495. In a quiet monastery refectory in Milan, a man who dissects corpses in secret, writes backward in a private code only he can read, and questions almost everything the church teaches, picks up a brush. He's been commissioned to paint a religious scene that hundreds of artists before him have already painted the same way. Christ, 12 apostles, a table, a halo over every holy head. It's practically a template. Leonardo throws the template out. No halos, no stiff rows of saints. Instead, he paints the exact instant chaos breaks out. The second after Jesus says, "One of you will betray me." And 11 men recoil in shock while one sits frozen in guilt. It's the most human depiction of that moment ever attempted. And buried inside its geometry, its shadows, and its 500-year decay, is a set of mysteries that historians, restorers, and even a few obsessive amateurs are still arguing about today. This is the real story of what might be hidden inside the Last Supper. No fabricated leaks, no anonymous whistleblowers. Just verifiable history, real researchers, and theories strange enough that you'll want to see the painting again with new eyes. To understand why anyone would even look for hidden meaning in this painting, you have to understand who painted it. Leonardo da Vinci filled thousands of notebook pages with his own private shorthand, written in mirror script, backward handwriting that only reads correctly when held up to a mirror. Historians still debate why. Some say it's simple practicality. Leonardo was left-handed, and writing backward kept his hand from smearing wet ink across the page. Others point out that he only used this technique for his personal notes, never for anything meant to be read by someone else, and argue that a habit born of convenience became a habit of secrecy. Either way, one thing isn't in dispute. Leonardo lived in an era where the wrong idea, said out loud, could get you killed. This was the world that would later put Galileo under house arrest for suggesting the Earth orbits the Sun, and burn Giordano Bruno alive for his cosmological theories. Leonardo, who dissected human bodies against church doctrine and quietly questioned the literal truth of Scripture in his private writings, understood exactly what silence was worth. So when art historians say Leonardo may have encoded ideas into his paintings that he couldn't say aloud, they're not inventing a personality trait for him. They're describing one he already had, documented in his own handwriting, in notebooks that still exist today. Here's where the real story gets strange, and it has nothing to do with hidden messages, at least not yet. When Leonardo began the Last Supper, he made a decision that baffled everyone around him. The standard technique for wall paintings at the time was true fresco, pigment applied directly onto wet plaster, so the paint physically bonds with the wall as it dries. It's fast and it's permanent. Leonardo hated working fast. He liked to reconsider, revise, and obsess over details. Something fresco doesn't allow, because once the plaster dries, you're finished. So he invented his own method instead, a mix of tempera and oil applied to dry plaster, sealed with a preparatory ground layer. It let him work slowly, blend color the way he wanted, and capture the kind of luminous detail that made him famous. It also doomed the painting almost immediately. Because the pigment was never chemically bonded to the wall the way true fresco is, it started flaking away within Leonardo's own lifetime. By some accounts, the mural looked significantly degraded within 20 years of its completion, and one 16th century writer described it as ruined less than 100 years after it was finished. Add centuries of humidity from a working kitchen next door, and the painting was fighting for survival almost from the day it was unveiled. Then things got worse. In 1652, monks cut a doorway directly into the wall, removing a chunk of the painting that included Christ's feet. In 1796, Napoleon's troops used the refectory as a stable and, according to some accounts, threw bricks at the mural. And in August 1943, an Allied bombing raid destroyed most of the cloister surrounding the refectory. The wall holding the Last Supper somehow survived, protected only by sandbags. By the 20th century, what museum visitors were looking at was, by most expert estimates, a small fraction of Leonardo's original paint. The rest had been overpainted by well-meaning restorers for hundreds of years, in some cases so heavily that the corrections obscured the original work more than the decay ever did. That's what finally led to one of the most ambitious restoration projects in art history. Beginning in 1978, conservator Pinan Brambilla Barcelon led a painstaking 21-year effort to strip away centuries of overpainting, grime, and glue, and recover whatever remained of Leonardo's actual hand. The team used infrared reflectography and other imaging techniques to see beneath the visible surface, distinguishing Leonardo's original brushwork from later additions layer by layer. It's slow, unglamorous, extremely careful work, and it's the reason art historians today feel confident they're looking at something much closer to what Leonardo actually painted than what visitors saw a century earlier. The restoration finally wrapped in 1999. Since then, the painting has been scanned at almost unimaginable resolution. Imaging teams have produced gigapixel-scale photographs stitched together from over 1,000 individual close-up shots, letting researchers and the public zoom in to examine individual brush strokes and cracks from a laptop screen. This is the same archive of high-resolution data that continues to fuel new analysis and new theories today, including the ones we're about to get into. In 2007, an Italian musician and computer technician named Giovanni Maria Pella proposed something that sounds almost too clever to be real. Pella had spent years studying the painting and noticed something about its composition. The loaves of bread scattered across the table, and the position of the disciples' hands seemed to align with a regular, repeating rhythm. Pella's theory works like this. Draw a musical staff, the 5 horizontal lines used in sheet music, across the tablecloth in the painting. Where the bread and hands land on those lines, read them as musical notes. Pella argued that when you follow this pattern from right to left, the same direction Leonardo wrote in his mirror script, the notes form a coherent 40-second musical composition. He performed it on an organ, and it does sound like a real, if simple, piece of music, with a somber, almost mournful character that some listeners feel fits the tragedy of the scene. Is it real? Art historians are split. Skeptics point out that with enough freedom to choose where you draw your lines, it's possible to find hidden patterns in almost any complex composition. This is a well-known cognitive trap called apophenia, where the human brain finds meaningful patterns in essentially random data. Pella's supporters counter that the specific spacing of the bread loaves is unusually regular for a still-life detail that has no narrative purpose, and that Leonardo's well-documented obsession with mathematics, proportion, and music makes the theory at least plausible. Nobody has definitively settled it. It remains one of the most fascinating, maybe, theories in Renaissance art. Now, here's a detail that isn't speculative at all. It's sitting right there in the painting for anyone to see. Every prior depiction of the Last Supper, going back centuries, painted Christ and his apostles with halos, the golden ring of light used throughout Christian art to instantly signal, this figure is holy. Leonardo left every single one out. Some art historians read this as a purely artistic choice. Halos are flat, symbolic devices, and Leonardo was obsessed with representing figures as physically and emotionally real, not as stylized icons. A halo would have broken the illusion of a real room, with real light, and real human panic unfolding around a real table. But others go further, arguing that the choice reflects something about how Leonardo privately understood faith. Several researchers who have spent years studying his broader body of work suggest that Leonardo, more naturalist than devout traditionalist, was using the painting to present Christ and the apostles as extraordinary people rather than untouchable, otherworldly icons. A subtle argument, made through composition rather than words, that greatness comes from humanity, not from divine decoration. We can't ask Leonardo which explanation is correct. But the choice itself is undeniable, and it's exactly the kind of quiet, deniable statement a careful, private thinker in a dangerous era might make. This next one you've probably already heard, largely thanks to a certain 2003 novel. Immediately to Jesus' right in the painting, traditionally the seat of honor, sits a figure with long, flowing hair, softer features and no beard, unlike every other apostle at the table. For centuries, this was understood by art historians to be the Apostle John, who was conventionally painted as young and androgynous in Renaissance religious art, following an established artistic tradition. Dan Brown's novel, The Da Vinci Code, turned this into something else entirely, proposing that the figure is actually Mary Magdalene, hidden in plain sight as evidence of a secret relationship with Jesus and a bloodline the Church supposedly suppressed for centuries. Nearly every serious Leonardo scholar rejects this reading. Milanese researcher and Da Vinci expert Mario Taddei has pointed out that Leonardo was working within a well-established visual tradition, where every apostle carried specific, recognizable attributes. Peter is shown holding a knife, Judas clutches a purse of silver, and John is consistently painted as the youngest and most delicate-featured apostle across dozens of Last Supper paintings that came before Leonardo's. In other words, the feminine appearance of the figure isn't a secret code. It's simply how John was always painted. The theory endures anyway, because it's a genuinely compelling story, and because Leonardo's own well-documented interest in blurring rigid categories, including gender expression in his art, makes it feel just plausible enough not to fully die. It's a good example of how a real artistic convention can curdle into an urban legend once enough people stop checking the history. The newest and strangest theory making the rounds doesn't ask who's in the painting. It asks whether Leonardo was even illustrating the story most people assume he was. A handful of researchers have recently argued that certain gestures and spatial choices in the Last Supper don't map cleanly onto the canonical gospel account of the betrayal. Instead, they suggest the composition draws more heavily on the Gnostic Gospels, a separate body of early Christian texts, including Gospels attributed to Mary Magdalene and Philip, that were excluded from the official Bible and only rediscovered in the 20th century, decades after most of this scholarship could have influenced earlier interpretations of the painting. This is a genuinely fringe theory, and it's important to say that clearly. Most Renaissance art historians remain unconvinced, and there's no direct evidence Leonardo had access to texts that, in some cases, weren't rediscovered until centuries after his death. But the theory persists because Leonardo's own documented skepticism toward rigid church doctrine makes people want to look harder at his choices, even when the evidence for any one alternative reading is thin. Strip away every theory, confirmed or fringe, and here's what's left. And honestly, it's still remarkable enough on its own. We know Leonardo abandoned safe, established technique for an experimental one that let him paint exactly the way he wanted, even though it meant the painting would start dying almost immediately. We know he broke centuries of visual convention by removing every halo in the scene. We know he filled his private notebooks with backward, coded handwriting his entire life, revealing a mind that instinctively reached for secrecy. We know the painting itself has survived a doorway cut through its base, an army using its room as a stable, and a bombing raid that leveled the building around it, protected, in the end, by nothing more than sandbags and luck. And we know that even now, 500 years later, with gigapixel scanners capable of resolving individual cracks in the plaster, and infrared cameras that can see through centuries of overpainting, researchers are still finding new details, still arguing about what they mean, and still disagreeing about how much of Leonardo's real intention anyone will ever fully recover. Maybe that's the most honest ending to this story. Not a single decoded manifesto, not one dramatic reveal, but a 500-year-old argument that refuses to end, because the man who started it built his most famous work to be looked at closely, questioned, and never fully settled. Leonardo spent his life writing in code, protecting ideas from a world he knew wasn't ready for them. Whether or not there's a literal hidden message in the plaster behind Christ's shoulder, he undeniably left us something else, a painting that, after 5 centuries of decay, war, restoration, and obsession, still makes people stop, lean in and ask, what am I actually looking at? And maybe that unanswered question is the real secret he left behind. If you want to see the theories with your own eyes, the full restored painting is viewable in ultra-high resolution online for free, link in the description. And if this kind of real, documented mystery is your thing, subscribe, because we're just getting started,